Good morning. We're going to get going. Good morning. Good morning. Hello. Don't mind me. I'm David Theo Goldberg. I direct the University of California Humanities Research Institute and the DML Research Hub. It's really a pleasure to welcome you and welcome many of you back to UC Irvine for what is the 8th Digital Media and Learning Conference, the second in a row here at Irvine, actually the third of the 8th. The second was at Irvine too. On the more nuanced considerations of what we might characterize as digital citizenship, having to do with access, engagement, and equity. We've done our best to order the best weather for you, though if the conference is up to any good, you won't enjoy any of it. So that will be the test of how readily we keep you in the room. It really is a pleasure to have you all here. I have a number of thank yous to advance to folks. First of all, our ongoing sponsor or sponsors, the MacArthur Foundation, which has been generous over the entire 8 years in helping to support the conference. The University of California Humanities Research Institute and its staff, and the Digital Media and Learning Hub, also sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation, and of course all of you without whom this would not be possible. So in a sense, in giving a round of applause to the MacArthur Foundation, you should also be applauding yourselves. I want also to thank the committee, both the advisory committee and the steering committee for this particular version of the conference, number 8. Could you stand up wherever you are? Sybil Madison Boyd, Andres Lomlonga, Bermudez, Kim Jackson, and Eric Klopfer. They've put the conference together for us today, and so it's a pleasure to have worked with you all. I want to welcome the University of California Irvine Vice Chancellor for Research, who has dropped in to hear the keynote. Pramod is somewhere sitting in the audience. He's been very supportive of us as well. We want to take a few minutes just to make some announcements before the introduction of the keynote by Danah Boyd. There's a number of changes that are in the air that I think will be appealing for folks to know about developments on this campus and more broadly about the future of the Digital Media and Learning Conference. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome my colleague and person in crime who conspires with us on a daily basis, Mimi Ito. Thank you very much.
So welcome everybody. Lovely to have you back here on the UCI campus again this year. It's hard to believe that 8 years ago I moved to UC Irvine to work with David and start up the Digital Media and Learning Hub, and this is the 8th year of our conference. And it's just been such a fabulous home here at Irvine, and also a lot of fun running the event at many different cities around the country during the years that it was running. It's been a great run, but as with all good things must come to an end at some point. But I'm also, so this will be our final Digital Media and Learning Conference. But with endings comes new beginnings. So we also have some very exciting new developments that we'd like to share with all of you, which is just a preview of the great things to come in the growing movement that has been fostered by DML and Connected Learning. As we announced at last year's event, we have been joined on the UCI campus by Constance Steinkuhler. I see Kurt in the back. Richard Aram, who is our new Dean of Education, and then most recently, Katie Salen has also joined the faculty here at the UCI campus, and together we are with David and Bill Maher, we're starting up, in the process of starting up, a new Connected Learning Lab here on campus, which is super exciting because all of my colleagues here are longtime friends of DML and part of the Connected Learning approach. So we're really eager to have, at least a critical mass of folks here on our local campus. But the big announcement that I wanted to make today, which is a new announcement for this year, is that we're joining forces with our broader network of colleagues and other events who have been kindred spirits in this space for many, many years. Starting next year, we are going to be joining forces to put on an annual Connected Learning Summit. The first summit is going to be held next summer at the MIT Media Lab. We already have the dates. If you go to the website, you can see our very preliminary website, but it does have the call for proposals. So you can already look, the kinds of formats, and you'll see that we are combining forces with Games Learning and Society, Sandbox Summit, and the Digital Media and Learning Conference. And you will see the sort of range of formats, the approaches from all of those events integrated under this umbrella of the Connected Learning Summit. So I wanted to invite the committee members for the newly inaugurated Connected Learning Summit to join me on the stage for a moment. Not everybody could be here, but you'll see that there's a mix of people from all three of the events who are helping us design and run the new ones. So. Sorry. Oh, yeah. And then we will be running this event every other year at the Media Lab and at UC Irvine, so that we're hoping this is friendly for people in different parts of the country. So Justin, Constance, Rika Rose, Scott, David, and then Eric couldn't be here, Mitch Resnick, Sam Dyson, Akili Lee. These are all the folks. Drew Davidson have been helping us run the event, and then the organizations that are co-hosting with us include a range of familiar folks, both here at Irvine and at MIT. So hope you will all join us for the new 2018 event next summer. Thank you. Oh, yeah. So I'm going to, yeah. Okay, so with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce, again, a longtime co-conspirator of mine and of DML. I feel like I get to be a bit of a proud parent and take credit for a tiny bit of Danah's successes. I first got to know Danah as advisor to her graduate work when she was at getting her PhD at UC Berkeley and working with Peter Lyman, and Danah was part of the Digital Youth Project, which, and we went on to author the Hanging Out Messing Around book together. But since then, Danah has had a very successful career in both academia and industry research, and as a leader of a think tank called Data and Society, which she launched in 2013, all while being a new parent and continuing an aggressive research agenda, building an organization that has really become sort of the place where people look to for thought leadership, social responsibility around new issues and big data and online participation. And so Danah is an incredible example of somebody who has had, very strong training on the academic and scholarly side, but has also been incredibly an amazing example of how to parlay those intellectual strengths, research into work that is genuinely making a huge impact in the world. Danah is particularly famous for, raising a lot of the really tough questions and causing trouble, and that's why we invited her to kick off our event today, because we are living through some really challenging times, and I think it's been a bit of a moment of reckoning for a lot of us who have looked to new digital technologies, online communities as places for youth engagement, youth participation, youth empowerment, but as recent events have shown us, that there are a lot of challenging dimensions that, both as people who care about young people, and their development, as well as educators, that we really have to take seriously even while we move forward in trying to make the most positive programs, interventions, media, research to help make the best out of today's digital and online environment. So I'm really counting on Danah to raise some of the really challenging questions that will hopefully animate our conversations for the rest of the event.
Good morning. How's everyone doing? All right, ready for a fun day, right? So it's an honor and pleasure to be here. There's many old faces and many new faces. And I have to admit that I was kind of startled when Mimi invited me to do this. Because for the longest time, Mimi has basically tried desperately to convince me that everything is positive and wonderful and we should focus on the good things. And I've been like, but there are dark forces. And she's just like, no. So this is an odd moment for me to be able to bring some of those conversations about darker dynamics into a conversation full of optimism. I need to first contextualize what I'm doing here. So I grew up as one of the first teenage cohorts who really used the internet. And of course that shaped a lot of how I think about things writ large. I think of it as my saving grace. But a lot of people don't necessarily understand what my participation looked like. And a lot of my participation was, in fact, very illicit. I was engaged in a lot of activities that we would now see as criminal. And part of why I'm here today is that I didn't get caught. And I think that's really important because a lot of people don't have that privilege. I also grew up in an environment that was pretty toxic. I was surrounded by KKK. I spent a lot of time dealing with religious intolerance. And I was queer, and my best friend was black, and we spent a lot of time trying to mess with those institutions. But that wasn't necessarily how the people around me thought about what was going on. And I think about that a lot as I do my research, because I spent 10 years trying to understand mainstream practices. And my goal in understanding mainstream practices was to get away from the extremist dynamics that I knew that I was a part of, the things that were totally outliers. At the same time, I paid attention to the things that were happening at the margins. I paid attention to those who were engaging in self-destructive and nefarious activities, not because I thought that they were part of the mainstream, but because I wanted to understand how their practices were intersecting with what we were seeing as broader dynamics. And a lot of what I've done in the last couple of years is bring a lot more of that to light, to really think about what's going on. But this is not necessarily to celebrate those extremist behaviors, because some of them are so deeply costly, but to acknowledge them. Not to acknowledge them as mainstream, but to acknowledge the power and the way in which they're shaping a whole slew of political and social conversation. So my talk today is really about the networks, communities, and practice that underpin our broader conversations right now about so-called fake news, or what happened in Charlottesville, the alt-right and the alt-light, and a variety of different kinds of media manipulation and really pathological ideas around race, around gender, around diversity. And I want you to understand what's happening, but I don't want you to understand this as though it is everything. I want you to understand what it means and what it means that we're paying so much attention to it. And with that in mind, I want to back up. It was the mid-2000s, and discussions around the internet were all focused on the dangers of the internet, right? TV hosts and journalists were speaking frothily about all of the risks that kids faced about the online world. There were sexual predators, and they were everywhere. Bullying was rampant. Suicide was the major belief of the outcome of the internet. We had to talk about child trafficking. You named horrible thing, and it was front and center for the media. And as far as the media was concerned at that time, it was danger all the way down. Most teenagers thought this was insane, right? And they laughed. They thought it was ridiculous. And as they joked around, they decided that they were going to try to play with those systems to see if they could change the conversation just for kicks and hoots. It was 2008, and Oprah Winfrey had spent yet another full episode dedicated to the dangers of online sexual predators. It was not the first time she had done this, nor will it be the last, but her breathless fear-mongering was really irritating for many. So shortly after this episode, a group of anonymous actors, who presumably were teenagers, decided to start shaping the message board around her show. So they just started to talk about a large network of pedophiles that were starting to come, and they were going to attack all of the children, right? And as they put these messages in, they knew that the folks who were programming Oprah were paying attention. Sure enough, on live TV, and one of her yet another loud and crazy episodes about sexual predators, she talked about how she had found a network of pedophiles represented by a teddy bear named Pedo Bear, with threatening the future of children. And as it was noted, he doesn't forgive, he doesn't forget. His group has over 9,000 penises, and they're raping children. Now, if you track 4chan or memetic conversations, you know how ridiculous this statement was. Over 9,000 is a well-known meme rooted in anime culture. The no forgive, no forget phrase is coming from the early days of Anonymous when they were messing with Scientology. Oprah didn't just get trolled. She did the work of trolls in spreading the message that they thought was really funny. And in doing so, she reinforced a belief that 4chan and internet subcultures had that the media was idiotic. And they had fun with her. Now, fast forward, and we got to see all sorts of different kinds of activities, ways of messing with larger institutional systems, right? Trying to take the algorithmic systems that were influencing the content that we'd see publicly and finding a way to mess with it for fun and entertainment. Now, as they were gaming it for early days of laughing out loud, lulz, before it became much more dark, it was really just to see and to prove to themselves that they could manipulate the systems. It was exactly like my peers who thought, well, we would have fun hacking into the national security infrastructure just to prove that we could. It was entertaining. But of course, as time would go on, others came with much more ideological, economic, or political motives. They started training each other. The online communities that they built, these anonymous environments, they started teaching each other new tactics, new approaches, ways of understanding and trying to get one step ahead of any of the systems out there. Right? They started messing with things like the Time 100 list, producing things like Rickrolling, things we thought were really fun. In other words, they were engaging in the kinds of participatory culture that our beloved friend Henry Jenkins has been describing for years, through their participation, through their engagement, and through their efforts to hack the attention economy. And of course, a lot of the content that they produced had a lot of in-jokes, a lot of references, a lot of things that made sense, but also showcased some of the darker pieces of things. So for those who don't know how to read this image, it is on one hand a delightful comedic image filled with all sorts of cultural references that we would normally find very fascinating. On the left, we have Pedo Bear, who we just referred to as the representative of all pedophiles on the internet. On the right, we have Pepe, who was originally an online representation of feelings and emotions for a lot of young men, who got repurposed by the end of last summer by the Anti-Defamation League to be a hate symbol. And, Pedo Bear is trying to support Pepe, as he's referring to, tell me it gets better, referring, of course, to the canonical notions within LGBT communities. Right? They're trying to make sense of and engage with what's going on writ large. Now, all of this gets birthed out of a site that we know as 4chan. 4chan began over a decade ago. It was created by a 15-year-old boy in his bedroom who he didn't want to tell his parents that he had created an online forum. And because people were using it at such frequent levels to produce images, he needed to find a way to not let them take over the entire server. So he created a particular infrastructure where he said that if posts were in reverse chronological order, and when they reached the bottom of the first page, rather than creating more pages where they would exist and be saved and stored, it would just disappear. And they invited them all to be anonymous, mostly because he didn't actually want to deal with the server infrastructure necessary to maintain accounts. This began the beginning of how we understand a lot of meme production, because quickly people who were using 4chan realized that if they wanted to keep something alive, they wanted to keep it remembered, they had to take it from the bottom of the pool and bring it back to the top. And if they were going to do that, they might as well modify it. And the modifications of it, of course, become all sorts of meme practice that we sort of love and adore, right? We've seen a ton of humor and political satire through these environments, through all of the kind of participatory culture that we sort of relish. And indeed, a lot of this is just absolutely delightful. But part of what happened as they were doing this, again, they come back to actually shaping and understanding what works. What communicative messages actually hit? What can be spread? How do you get these things to strategically spread? And we see that kind of learnings occur for the latter part of the last decade. And that's really fascinating until those folks start to get political, until we start to see a whole variety of other actors start to come into these environments. We start to see the birth from these online fora goes from rickrolling to Anonymous, which was originally about challenging Scientology, to a much more political approach. And then we start to see battles over WikiLeaks, which appeal to some of our politics and not others. And then, of course, we get into a world of Gamergate, which we will come back to. And then we start to see people who believe they memed the president into being, right? It doesn't matter whether or not they did. It doesn't matter whether or not they had an impact on last year's election. They believe they did. And that belief has been more powerful than you can possibly imagine. Because not only have they doubled down since the election trying to figure out how to scale what they are doing, they have been able to move a lot more people in that direction to engage with their practices and their activities. And for some, those practices are very much about the politics of who Trump is. For others, it's fun and games. And what's interesting about this environment is that when it began as a group of 15-year-olds who were really obsessed with anime and pornography, they couldn't imagine that they would be a part of a broader geopolitical conversation. That we would see a whole set of long-standing actors, including white supremacists, Hindu nationalists, foreign political actors, all suddenly work together with them, all being willing to share tactic without necessarily sharing end goal. So let's talk about exactly what they did or how they played those games, because understanding that is actually a really fascinating moment where we realize the kinds of digital media practices that we're starting to see unfold. How many of you saw the news about Hillary's health last year? Concerns about how she was feeling. That wasn't accidental. In August of 2016, a whole set of online communities started obsessing over her health. Some of the communities had been obsessed with whether or not she was ill since she had had a concussion and at the same time as the Benghazi issues were playing out. But there was a new level of obsession with this. There were anonymous groups who purported to believe that she was sick. And the more I watched them, the more I was actually convinced that they had hacked into her system. And I suspect some of them were actually foreign because of the way that they were trying to trigger certain conversations. But they were all talking about how the media wasn't paying attention to this. This is August of 2016. So they decided to do something about it. Now, rooting in game culture, what they do is they pretend like they're going on a raid. It's a campaign. It's strategic. They basically propose ideas, upvote each other's ideas, believe into what's going on, encourage each other to pile on, try things, throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. There's no hierarchy. Everything is anonymous. But there's a hive mind mindset that actually shapes a lot of what's happening. They post videos of her coughing to YouTube, create memes of how she was coughing, posted blog posts all over the internet talking about her lack of stamina. Facebook pages were devoted to the topic. The conversation was triggered so that there were all sorts of less established media sites starting to talk about this throughout August. Folks create sock puppets. These are fake accounts that exist primarily on Twitter, but to a lesser degree on Facebook. And they're not actually trying to spread misinformation. They're usually there to ask questions. So they post all over Twitter. They ask journalists, is Hillary sick? What's going on? I hear she's coughing all the time. Have you heard anything? What do you know? Right? Those kinds of questions, of course, are cat bait for a media obsessed with figuring out how to break a news story. So they sit there and they're like, is something going on? What's going on? I don't know what's going on. And they try to find out. They try to look into it. They try to investigate. So on September 11th, when she passes out at a memorial service, the media was already vulnerable to her efforts. They pounced. They knew exactly how to respond to this narrative. And if any of you were paying attention on that day, every news organization forwarded a notification to your phone telling you that she was sick and that she had pneumonia. Right? They were paying attention because they were architected to pay attention. Now, the groups didn't know necessarily that she would pass out, but they were trying. This was one of many campaigns that they were trying, and this one landed. This one landed because the media was paying so much attention to this conversation that they managed to amplify that message very much by creating honeypots. Now, what's notable about all of these efforts that we're seeing is the unbelievable sophisticated and thought-out engagement with social media and the broader information landscape. The kinds of deeply engaged practices that we rarely see except in the forms of participatory culture that many of us in the room relish. But a lot of it is now to understand what is it that they can then move. Right? Now, in the community of educators and overly educated folks, many of us here, knowledge is very much relished. We see the internet as a space for helping people learn and access information, share with others. The networks that I'm referring to are obsessed with knowledge and how it will give them power. They see it as their only way to access power is to work collectively and strategically using information and capitalizing on what people don't know. They pore over communications literature. You've never seen better comms classes than you see as the training in these environments. They pore over military documents and marketing materials, trying to figure out what are good techniques and tactics that they can use. They systematically and collectively work to detect vulnerabilities in culture as well as technology. They really try to understand what normies do. And in many actors in politics and business, they very much work to exploit that. And a huge part of what they work to exploit is how people consume or understand information. Now, I've been long frustrated with a lot of what happens when the ideas in this room percolate out into a whole variety of other environments and get misinterpreted. And I have a whole section in It's Complicated, the book I wrote, about what happened when educators decided to go out and tell young people that Wikipedia was not true. Right? This was a narrative that was propagated for a whole variety of different reasons, and we can go into critiques about that, but overwhelmingly across schools in this country, every teacher heard this lesson that they should tell their students that Wikipedia is not true. And so then the question is, what should replace that? And over again, what young people heard, whether or not that's what they were told, was don't trust Wikipedia, trust Google, right? And so as a result, you would have these moments where young people would be like, okay, well, I didn't look it up on Wikipedia, but I looked it up on Google. And you're like, and what is Google made of? Now, fast forward, and that's one of the things we start to see happening not just amongst young people. My collaborator, Francesca Tripodi, was interviewing voters in Virginia a couple months ago as they were casting their ballots in the primary election there. Primaries are interesting because even if you are committed to one political agenda or another, you don't necessarily be able to get to vote a ticket line in a primary. If you are a Republican, you're trying to figure out which Republican to vote for. And so she was really curious, how were they getting information? And of course, they kept coming back to her like, definitely not fake news. Which of course they mean to say CNN. And they're definitely rejecting all forms of mainstream media. This is a place where things are primarily conservative and there's a rejection of mainstream media. And so she's like, but where? If you're rejecting CNN, where? She was like, Google. And she's like, okay, so you're going to Google, what are you looking up? What are you seeing? Like, no, we go to Google. She was like, okay, can you show me? And she sat down with them and realized that what they were doing was typing in the name of every person who was running for office into Google and just looking at what Google sent back to them. All of the personalized content, all of the news with its headlines and its bait content, that was what they were using to inform them for the political election. Now, that's exactly what a lot of these groups know how to mess with, right? They know how to deal with these things, and that makes those of us who are really interested in different forms of media and digital literacy absolutely cringe. We're going to bang our heads on the table and be like, why can't we do this right? And often the rhetoric comes back to, well, we just need more media literacy and more critical thinking. And in almost every case, we can imagine a perfect environment where that will work out well, and many of us as educators work towards that environment. But part of what I'm interested in is how that gets turned on its head and purposefully used against us, which is exactly what I've started to watch these groups know how to do. They hear the rhetoric and they learn how to twist it. So I'm going to talk about what it means to undo versions of critical thinking by going first to a case that I find very fascinating. Robin Kaplan, another colleague of mine, and I have been obsessively watching Fox News. And one of the things that we've been interested in is the regular story that comes up probably every 3 to 4 days of a female teacher raping a student. And we've gone through tons of rabbit holes. Why is this story being produced? What is the focus of this? What's going on? Of course, you start really obsessing over this, you can find out that almost every other major newspaper will eventually cover this topic, but Fox does it probably the best. And I was, kind of uncomfortable with this. Now, let's be honest, I don't trust Fox, right? That's my own personal proclivities and my own biases. But when I see countless articles in all these other environments, I'm like, why is this such a common narrative? And of course, it's a conversation you want to cover. If somebody is being arrested in your community, you're going to cover it in the news. But of course, it's covered in a way that fills into a lot of levels of anxiety, collectively suggesting that there is an epidemic. Now, I'm also wary of epidemics. I've lived through a bunch of them as a researcher. Bullying was an epidemic, trafficking was an epidemic, sexual predation was an epidemic. And in each one of these cases, we were able to come up with and show data that turned out to be far more complicated than what people understood. And yet we were never able to get people away from the rhetoric of the fact that it was an epidemic. It kept working as an epidemic even when we as researchers were like, data suggests otherwise. And so I was like, this is sort of fascinating. What does it mean to be producing this epidemic, and what does the data look like? And what I found out is that we actually don't have data on this. We know that roughly 800 teachers a year are convicted of some form of sexual misconduct with children. We know that a tiny percentage of, that's a tiny percentage of all sexual misconduct. We know that more than 80% of teachers are female, so we can kind of work out that this is a really biased news story. But because we can't find really good statistics, we don't really know what's going on. And so the haunting portrait actually stands in overwhelmingly and consistently as the rhetoric. So what's the underlying motivation? And of course, this is where, even as a critical thinker, you start to get into some deeply paranoid and skeptical and political ideas of what's going on here, right? Why are so many websites devoted to this topic? If you start doing these searches, and I warn you, it's a whole beautiful rabbit hole, there's a ton of websites telling you all sorts of details about these groups. Now, my hunch, because I already distrust what's going on, is that this is all about a way of arguing against schooling. That this is actually a way of proving that schools are a dangerous place that fits really well in an environment where we want to push for charters and vouchers and homeschooling and a resistance to different forms of school from conservative environments. But of course, that's a really cynical view. And that's a really tricky one, because I'm not convinced that any one journalist has that as their agenda. But what does it mean that that fits into a particular frame that a lot of people need to deal with? And this is where I struggle, because I've never been able to persuade people to chill out about bullying. So I'm not sure that I could ever persuade people to chill out about this, because no matter what, any crime against a child is pretty horrific. But what does it mean that that's set in motion, then juxtaposed next to a narrative of critical thinking? And Dean Freelon's been doing some really fascinating work on this idea of critical thinking. And I don't know how much you can read the details of this, but part of it is the rhetoric that almost always goes with things that look like conspiracy theories is a rhetoric that talks about critical thinking. So this is the idea of the earth being flat, right? And it all being about, well, we get people to critically think about it. We have to question whether or not the earth is really round. Or, let's see if I can see this. The idea of RT News, which is an amazing environment from Russia Today, just how reliable is the evidence that suggests that human activity impacts climate change? The answer isn't always clear, and it's only possible to make a balanced judgment if you are better informed. By challenging the accepted view, we reveal a side of the news that you wouldn't normally see, because we believe that the more you question, the more you know. This is what critical thinking looks like and how it has been repurposed in a variety of different political environments at this moment. It's the ability to look in and try to understand things and to invite the public to go and self-investigate. And that rhetoric of self-investigation is really important. Let's talk about some cases of self-investigation. Probably one of the most famous that is very clearly linked to the dynamics of social media comes from Dylann Roof. For those of you who don't know, he committed a terrible act of absolute hate-oriented mass murder. And in the fallout from this, they found a manifesto that he had posted online. And that manifesto was all about why he had gone and started searching for different information and how he had been awakened to a narrative that we now understand as white supremacist and white nationalist. And what he said, the event that truly awakened me was the Trayvon Martin case. I kept hearing and seeing his name, and eventually I decided to look him up. I read the Wikipedia article, and right away I was unable to understand what the big deal was all about. It was obvious that Zimmerman was in the right, but more importantly, this prompted me to type the words black on white crime into Google. And I have never been the same since that day. The first website I came to was the Council of Conservative Citizens. There were pages upon pages of these brutal black on white murders. I was in disbelief. At this moment, I realized that something was very wrong. How could the news be blowing up over the Trayvon Martin case when hundreds of these black on white murders get ignored? What we call research, what we talk about as in critically interrogating our assumptions, can get turned around and do get turned around and get politicized to turn around to actually push people down a very deeply disturbing path. Fast forward to Pizzagate. This is an active and strategic manipulation from the same networks that I've been talking about. After Podesta's emails were released, a network of people decided to try to understand and find damning information of the Clinton campaign. Many of the people who were engaged in these conversations were very conspiratorial in their thinking. But as with all conspiracies, there's always something rooted in a sense of reality. Something is going on. One of the things that I learned after years of trying to understand trafficking and sex crimes against children is that people used encoded messages for years. And one of the most common encoded messages that I learned from the FBI when I was doing this was to make phone calls requesting for pizza with different flavors to describe what kind of children you wanted. That's not totally out of crazy base when you realize that a lot of Christian conservative communities have long been pushing against sex crimes against children and working on these conversations of pedophilia. So this starts to fit together and make sense that there must be something here with all these references to pizza. So this conspiracy theory happens in the online environment. And that's normal conspiracy stuff, and it normally goes away. Except that a bunch of people decided that they were going to leverage this moment to play with the media. Because the thing that you also quickly learn is that there's impact to getting the media to shift their thinking. And indeed, one of the things that they worked on was trying to get the media to actually get traction by negating it, to really, really focus on the fact that it was wrong. And the reason that they were trying to negate it is that when you live in a media landscape where most people don't trust the media, and the media tells you that there is something crazy here, you believe that there has to be something real. And so you start to self-investigate. And we, of course, get to hear about Pizzagate because one of the crazy people who went and self-investigated show up with a gun, right? And that's how we hear about it. But it was a long and systematic process to get it into the media, to get it negated. And this is about capitalizing on something that is referred to as the Boomerang Effect. The more people talk about something, the more people will start to think it's real when they don't trust the messenger. Now, the way that they learned from this was actually learning from the reports of the CDC. The CDC had been tracking media coverage of the correlation between autism and vaccination. And what they were really frustrated by was that the more the media negated that correlation, right, the more the media said that this has nothing to do with what's going on, the more the population believed it to be true. And Pizzagate was one of many efforts to try to see if they could reproduce the same dynamic. Right? Could they reproduce it in a messy information landscape? All right, so how is this stuff backfiring, and what do we do about it? Now, I don't believe that any technology company, educator, or the media sets out to misinform people. But I do believe that we design systems under the vision of an ideal outcome, imagining cases that reflect our values, our logics, our norms, how we think people will operate. And we don't necessarily grapple with how people with different values and approaches to the world might use the systems in fundamentally different ways. We don't necessarily know how to deal with the unintended consequences of our well-intended interventions. So in the 1990s, there were discussions of anorexia in online environments, and people were really outraged, in particular parents, who were concerned that this was actually promoting anorexia. So there were pressure on a variety of different tech companies to stop talking about these topics. And for a company like AOL, sitting in the middle of this firestorm, they needed to do something. So they decided to remove all references to anorexia, to basically censor content that referred to anorexia. And it went away for a second, because what popped up immediately after was people then talking about their best friend, Anna. Anna is the most common name in the United States, especially in these online environments at the time. So talking about Anna was not going to be censored, particularly when the conversation would be like, hey, Anna and I got together today, but like we got into such a fight, and like, I can't believe the fallout we had. In other words, I fell off the bandwagon and decided to eat some food today, right? Those conversations produce what we now know as a pro-Anna culture and thinspiration. Every time we try to moderate some of this content, it pops up in new and complicated ways. Content moderation is one of the hardest things to do. And one of the things I've gotten the privilege of doing over the years is try to architect content moderation policies. Every rule you create, someone will find a way to bend the content to sneak around the wire. So one of the things I remember when I was working in content policy of Flickr we were trying to figure out how to deal with what constituted adult content in what part of the region around the world. You can imagine how quickly messy this got. Breasts. Breasts are always the problem in this conversation. Are breasts pornographic or are they not, right? What about when they involve breastfeeding? What about when it's dealing with cancer education? How do you deal with breasts? And so we have these constant elements of like, okay, well, breastfeeding, not pornographic, lustful images, pornographic, how do we start to separate this? We had made all of these content policies and asked for an implementation. And I remember the first image we got back where we had to struggle with it. It was a picture of a woman holding a baby in the natural form that you would think of as a classic, beautifully pictured breastfeeding idyllic image. And the baby looked really adorable, except that the baby's face was photographed to be a 50-year-old white guy lustfully staring at this breast. Is it a lustful image? Is it a breastfeeding image? How do we actually deal with this? Content moderation is one of those problems where the more that you try to create rules, the more you find the edges, because humans are tremendously creative around this. And playing whack-a-mole on it is one of the reasons why you see a lot of resistance to doing these dynamics, because you almost don't want to see that iteration. But that iteration happens even in the darkest of places. 4chan for the longest time, which we talked about, was seen as an anything goes platform where any content was acceptable and it would never be moderated. There was child pornography on those pages. There was all sorts of swastikas and neo-Nazi symbols. There was more racist speech than you could ever stomach on a daily basis. And it was okay until one thing broke it, and that was Gamergate. Right? Gamergate was the first moment where the entire leadership of the team went, I give up, I can't deal with this. Now, what is Gamergate? And you will hear a whole set of conversations about Gamergate, and I'm not going to try to narrate our way through it, but what is important to understand about Gamergate is that the politics of purposefully making it hard to understand what Gamergate is half of the goal. Narrating it simultaneously as a very anti-female, very misogynistic activity at the same time that it gets narrated as ethics in journalism confused the heck out of everyone. And it was where we actually learned the beauty and strategy of ambiguity. And Whitney Phillips spends a lot of time in her most recent book really trying to untangle these issues of ambiguity, because ambiguity has become one of the best communicative tactics around all of this, using humor, using irony, using what's referred to as posed law, right? And the idea of posed law is to not be able to, or to push forward something as though it is a parody of something, when in fact what you're doing is creating the belief in that something. And that's where we start to see the instability of communication mechanisms, the beautiful creativity of speech, plausible deniability, all sorts of ways of messing with things because we can work around all the communicative markers. We can also encode content consistently. Now, that is part of what makes a lot of these environments tricky, because it's not actually inaccurate or fake information. A lot of it is just deeply distorted, deeply framed. Now, a lot of that encoded message that we saw with young people, where they would encode content along with the ambiguous language, also fits into a broader set of strategies that have been capitalized strategically. So the networks of teenagers that I tracked ended up with a lot of folks who had a much longer-term agenda on using different kinds of frames to hide in plain sight, using symbols like 1488 to find compatriots who were moving towards a white supremacist and white nationalist radicalized idea. And just as young people who were really at the margins of like LGBT communities learned how to encode messages, so did a whole set of youth who were trying to move across these environments. So what begins as a joke in an online environment where the N-word is thrown around as though it's just funny, or where we have different kinds of swastikas just to piss off our parents, suddenly slips into and becomes a set of ideologies that are extraordinarily racist and anti-Semitic. This is the same sort of strategies that we've seen people deal with as they use a lot of social media marketing, except this is where we're seeing the marketing of white supremacist ideas into the mainstream. And I really want to highlight two key things from these images, because these images are pretty darn disturbing. The first is the idea that we have a set of rhetoric around race realism. That is the entryway for a lot of racist thinking. Why is it that we can have black fraternities when we can't have white fraternities? That act of asking that question is where we see people opening up to a broader set of frame of deeply disturbing thinking. And the ability to consistently ask questions, to use sock puppets across Twitter, not only to ask questions of journalists, but to ask questions of the public, is where we see people moved across these agendas. And all of a sudden, it gets polarized because it even gets magnified by the media. So in the bottom right picture, that is CNN posting on the bottom of it saying, alt-right founder questions if Jews are people. Right? The act that that question can even be asked becomes a problem. Because this is about opening the Overton window, opening the range of things that are acceptable to talk about in public, as though the possibility of talking about these questions of race realism or these questions of anti-Semitic ideas are acceptable. We used to know how to do strategic silence. My colleague Joan Donovan spends a lot of time talking about how the news media used to choose not to cover Klan rallies. The KKK has never disappeared. It is still around. But we haven't covered Klan rallies for a long time. Because since the 70s, we've decided as a media landscape that this was not an acceptable topic to put on TV or to put in print. And as a result, most of the public didn't realize that they weren't going on, but they also weren't able to radicalize more people in that process. And that was really important. In the youth environment, this is actually how we combated a whole set of issues around suicide. There was consistent data in the 80s that showed that the more that journalists covered suicides in the front page or in the headlines, the more you increase suicide ideation and suicide attempts amongst those who were actually already thinking in those terms. It became a triggering effect. And now we've undone all of this. We cover Klan rallies, we cover suicides as though they're front page, we send notifications to people's phone about people who die by suicide. We have a TV show that is the largest show ever downloaded by Netflix that basically normalizes suicide as one of our mainstream media contents. We've lost the ability to do strategic silence. And we don't even know what that looks like in a networked age because we keep justifying it that if somebody else is talking about it, we should too. Now we've got a broader problem because this is geopolitical, right? And I'm sure you're going to spend a lot of time talking about Russia over the next couple of months. Certainly the media and Congress are, because it's not just about whether or not they actually contorted the election. It's a question of what kind of content they produced. And what you will find is that the content that was produced from folks who are going to be associated or affiliated with Russia, which by and large are not going to be the Kremlin, but they're going to be a whole set of folks that are living in the same networks I've been tracking for years, are the folks who are actually working to destabilize information landscapes. They're looking at ambiguity. They're trying to get people to polarize, to ask questions, to be confused, to distrust institutions and information intermediaries. And you know what? We're going to spend the next N number of months obsessing over this, doing exactly what they were trying to do. We are going to scale their ability to confuse the public over information in the process of trying to go and investigate whether or not that information was happening. And we're going to cover news stories like Charlottesville with gaping attention, which is a horrific situation, but for which the coverage of it has done more to radicalize people than I think most people recognize. Everyone in the room knows how valuable it is to be a part of something that's bigger, to have purpose and meaning in your life, to be a part of a community. That's part of why you show up here, right? This is a community of like-minded people. And that's what we want to instill in youth. We're often encouraging them to find a place where they belong. But what happens when you have a whole set of destabilized identities and a whole set of folks who are going to mobilize to shape that towards particular agendas? Take, for example, what's going on with Milo Yiannopoulos. Many of you are on college campuses and maybe are paying attention to what he's doing. He is showing up on college campuses saying that conservatives are being censored by liberals, saying that that there's no free speech on these liberal college campuses, and showing up on campuses where his speeches are a list of people who are undocumented on those campuses, right, in order to get that into the public eye. But his primary goal is to get a lot of media attention to get kicked off those campuses, because every time he does, more people start to be sympathetic to his views. They start to realize that these liberal institutions are not allowing so-called free speech. They're not actually even socialized into an understanding of what we even talk about around what is free speech, or what we mean about the dynamics between the right to speak and the right to be amplified. This, like race realism, is a moment of opening a conversation, of radicalizing. And what worries me the most right now are the kinds of media landscapes that we're building and the ways we're moving across information landscapes to help enable radicalization. And one of the things I have to give a lot of credit to these networks is that they know how to leverage that strategically. So here's where we're at. We've created an environment where we thought there would be power to give everybody a soapbox. We wanted to open up and make possible voices that have historically been marginalized and not part of the mainstream. We have very much celebrated that in this community, the ability to let people speak loudly who had not been heard because they've been disenfranchised in all sorts of political ways. But at the same time, these dynamics have long been twisted for folks who have much more nefarious goals and agendas. And they've been able to capitalize on this not only by capitalizing on the information landscape, by the social media infrastructure, but by the vulnerabilities within the broader mainstream media ecosystem that will amplify all of their concerns at a moment where we have broader destabilized and anxious public. So I keep thinking, what hath we wrought? What did we build? What did we intend to build? And how do we grapple with the unintended impact of well-intended interventions? Thank you. The good news is I left time for questions. Of course, all of you can't just be silent and go, so come on. Who's got questions? All right, back there, 1, 2. I was allowed to be troublemaking, see?
Thank you very much. So I have a question about your current thinking. When you brought up the idea of strategic science as a tool and a possible intentional thing, how are you thinking about that and thinking about guideposts? I'm imagining also your opening comments about trying to have definitions and flicker is problematic. But can you talk a little bit about your guideposts?
Right, so, yes, summarize for the video and for everyone in the room. I mentioned strategic silence, which is a lot of what Joan Donovan has been working on. What is my current thinking and how does this impact the broader dynamic? So, this is a conversation that we keep having at Data and Society on a regular basis. And it's a long and fraught conversation that happens pretty much weekly because Joan is really concerned about how we have undone it because of media incentives. And she points out the different kinds of media incentives, right? So the economics of how mainstream media works, the way in which they feel like they have to break news. If somebody else is talking about it, they feel pressure to talk about it too, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of what she's been thinking is, how do you clamp down on that conversation? On the other hand, my other colleague, Matt Gertson, who has been really looking at the red pilling or radicalization of a lot of these dynamics, has been watching very closely as these groups have looked at the efforts to censor or engage in strategic silence as a way then of proving that these companies or these media are even more broken. And so they're actually pushing that. They're pushing this conversation in preparation. And the result is that we're all scratching our heads going, shit. As we talk to a variety of social media companies, we've seen a variety of interesting tactics. And a lot of it has to do with dynamics of amplification. So one of the things, hopefully all of you know that what you get on your Facebook newsfeed or what youth get on their Facebook newsfeed is not everything posted by their network, less than 10%. If that's news to you, let's talk. But one of the things that's interesting is how they choose what to weight on those networks. And this weighting is a mess, right? It's an ongoing challenge. But one of the things that they do is they've got different classes of devaluing content, right? So there's content that they want to amp up because everybody's loving it, because it's paying attention, this is great, these are highly valued, get it to as many people as possible content for a variety of different reasons. And then there's content that just isn't that kind of cool, it's not that sexy, so maybe test it out and see if some people like it in case it'll get amplified, because if you don't try it, you may not know that some people really like it. And then there's content that people start to acknowledge as being problematic. And so this is content that is down-weighted. So it's just not really encouraged to be out there. And then there's the content that's marked as being problematic for a variety of different reasons. And this content is actually never shown in the newsfeed. It is shown only if you go to somebody's page. Right? So this is a way in which you're seeing these interesting rankings. You certainly see this within all of the major search queries that are out there. Right? So autocomplete. There's a lot of content removed from autocomplete. Not enough, and you can always find new ways of finding really problematic autocomplete. But this is one of the things that they're constantly trying to look for, and the lists that these companies have to try to say, hey, we're not going to encourage these searches because these searches are leading people down deeply disturbing paths. Or likewise, content that, for various reasons, is down-weighted in the search results. But it's a huge challenge because what is it that people are looking for, and should it be their responsibility, or when should it be their responsibility to not allow that search? And I think this is one of the reasons why Joan is so obsessed with this topic, is because I think it comes back down to an existential crisis. We don't know what it should look like in this contemporary environment, but we need a lot more people to be asking those questions. And we need to be asking those questions not just as though we are goody two-shoes and we can find a third-party entity that can say what is good content, what is bad content, because let me tell you, that will never work. But how do we actually work together to understand simultaneously the efforts to try to encourage certain kinds of content and depress certain ones across a whole set of different value systems? And what can we do to strategically work across that? This, by the way, is one of the biggest anxieties that major tech companies are having right now, is how to deal with content that is completely accurate, but pivoted in a particular frame that sends people into a deeply dark and disturbing place. And I think it's going to be one of the biggest challenges going forward, far more important than actually inaccurate information. Yeah.
Create new forms of social norms, practices, and ideas of community that were obviously very destructive. I think one of the things that I find really provocative about your talk is that you're really pointing to the ways in which all tools can be weaponized. All infrastructures, have consequences that we can't control. And I think it's really important to kind of ask these questions about how the content itself reflects various values. But I wonder if there's a larger kind of question about for whom this infrastructure was built to begin with. And so if that infrastructure was never built to support norms and communities that we seek to foster, however we conceive of the we, how does asking questions about the content at that level reflect a kind of, how might that be a kind of strategy in when we have that the whole kind of larger infrastructural problem that ultimately shapes our queries, shapes our norms, shapes our values, so on and so forth.
Nope, absolutely. And I think this is one of the strangest and most challenging dynamics of watching the social media landscape build out as fast as it did. I will put myself with my other hat on. I spent a lot of time actually working for these tech companies and building out these infrastructures. So you're looking at part of the we that designed these systems. And I'll be honest with you, we were focused on the early adopters of self-identified geeks, freaks, and queers in America. We were looking at the folks who were socially marginalized. In other words, we were looking at us. And we were saying, how can we connect them to do awesome things? And my role in those environments was always to drive everybody crazy and make them think about other groups. I'll never forget the bright idea that I had when I was working at Google at Blogger. And I decided that I would show my colleagues, the engineers, and the product people, I would put a script up so we could see every post that would come up, or it was posts every 2 seconds, so it would constantly flip, so that people could get a flavor for what it was that people were actually doing with the tools that we built. I had to take it down really fast because I didn't realize just how much pornography there was in that content stream. And we were all like, ooh. But even a lot of the content that was not pornographic, we were just like, oh. It's actually really hard when you're building these systems to imagine the diversity of our public, even when your team is actually that diverse. It's really hard to get your head around it when you're working on a particular piece of the puzzle. And one of the things that's difficult is that this has happened in massive fire and rapid formation. These technologies went from non-existent to extraordinarily large in a way that they're not sustainable. Twitter is going to collapse. That organization can barely function. It's amazing the site is still up. Most of these sites were built out of duct tape. right? And so they now have such huge political importance. They shape our democracy, they shape our information landscape, they shape our economy. But they weren't built to be this big. And it's also a really weird and disturbing environment because they were also built in an environment and a time when financialized capitalism was really corroding and shaping every sector out there. And so one of the things that people don't realize about tech, big tech is the only thing that's been resistant to hedge funds, right? Like the only things that's not getting taken over by private equity because of how they've architected their system. So as they build out these systems, the organization becomes afraid of finance, not even sure what to do with what it means to be a part of the public. They also start to be part of a geopolitical battle, right? Because what's going on in China as we're seeing the building out of these systems is creating competitive. The reason I'm giving you this context is that there isn't a full thinking about what public or who's public in a financialized capitalistic ecosystem, in a geopolitical environment where we can't decide between globalization and nation-state tensions, in a world where we simultaneously are trying to build diverse networks and are seeing hardcore tribalism. And so the we gets really contorted on every front, even in America, as these networks play out. The point is not to say that these companies don't have a lot of power and a lot of responsibility at this moment. But I don't think that anyone, including in those companies and including the public, really knows what the ask should be. I don't think, and like when I hold these sessions where I'm like, okay, so what do we ask of Facebook? What do we ask of Google? What do we want them to do? And folks focus in on what is important to them. And then we go to a different environment and are like, oh, that's not how it's being thought. Because the pressure that these companies are getting from outside of the US is pretty astounding. So let me put that in something concrete. Facebook realized in February, March of last year, 2016, that their content was being corrupted for all sorts of nefarious purposes. And they started removing a lot of that content. And they got called out for censoring conservative speech. Every major media empire challenged them and said that they were being biased and whatnot. And they put their hands up, not knowing what to do, and said, fine, we'll just stop doing that, right? And as a result, they allowed a lot of this to become much more corrosive. So this is why I say, like, I agree with you. I'm not sure I know what the answer is. And I'm really struggling because I think that everybody wants somebody else to fix this problem. But the problem is fast, networked, and systemic. And that's where I think that the creativity and the challenges have to think about the vulnerabilities and the manipulations and the weaponization at the same time that we think about what the good intentions are. But there was no doubt that that wasn't what it was designed for. There's now a microphone, so you got it, and then you're going to give it back there.
Yes. Danah, love this talk, and mine is just racing. So 2 quick questions. Been fortunate to come to some of your Data Society meetings earlier on, and was struck with the lack of diversity in terms of folks who understand the algorithms. So what you just did a minute ago, talking about all the buckets, I think most of us have no understanding around that. So how do we engage in the fight if many of us don't have the literacies to do it, and we're actually, with a lot of changing and funding, there's not even really funding to create the curriculum to begin to develop the literacies in the population. And the last thing is, do you imagine that we might enter into a, I'm going to say, dark age in the sense we're just going to have to shut these systems down and to rebuild, or can we fix them, or is it more like, shut them, let's rethink it, and get back to our interactions one-to-one as opposed to one-to-many?
Right. How many of you in the room are qualitative researchers? So one of the things I love about qualitative research is that we learn to ask questions of people and understand why people are doing what they're doing from worlds and perspectives that are not our own. We learn to appreciate somebody else's worldview. One of the funniest things about qualitative research is somehow we haven't targeted that at people building technology, but rather the description or the abstraction of technology. I actually think from a qualitative skill set, without even knowing how to code, you could actually spend a lot of time trying to understand what engineers are doing and why, how they're thinking about things. With an understanding of organizational theory, which is rooted in most sociological degrees, you can actually understand the complexities of a big socio-technical organization as the engineers and the product people work at cross purposes for the policy and comms people. You can understand the mess, you can understand the gaps. So I don't think it's just about necessarily understanding engineering, although I do believe that there is power in understanding how to code. I think there's a lot of power in knowing how to ask the right questions of those who are building the systems. And like many of the folks that I have learned, there is actually nothing more powerful for nudging people than learning how to ask the right questions of those people. And asking those great questions means showing up where they're at, showing up in engineering conversations, not just throwing fire bombs across the wall at Silicon Valley. Right? It's really about trying to understand what they're doing and then challenging them on their own terms. Because otherwise we get the classic dynamic we've always gotten from geeks, which is just like, don't talk to me, I don't want to talk to you. Right? And that's not effective. And that's one of the things I say as researchers, we actually have the power to do that, and I would invite all of you to really do that. Now, as for whether or not we can change this, I don't know. I'll be honest with you, I don't know. I know the vision, I know the beauty. I also know, the nice thing about being a scholar is to know that these things go in cycles, that new technologies were built and repurposed for all sorts of shitty things across time. I happen to be living and breathing in a dynamic about manipulation of the census these days. And the thing that I love the most about studying the census is to realize that since 1790, people have messed with that data set consistently, systematically, for every reason under the sun. And so none of it's new. And so this is where it's one of those interesting moments where it's, organizations have always gained too much power and then there's been a struggle, things have shifted. So, if I take the long haul view, I know that things are going to shift. And I'd like to believe that they're going to shift towards a more progressive ideal that I happen to live by. And I know that that's going to be a fight, and I know that everybody in this room has to contribute to that fight. But do I know what the actual technologies will be at the end of this? No. Am I convinced that trying to regulate it under the terms of, say, the Chinese government is a good idea? No. And I think that that's where it's really tricky for me, is like, how do we work this out? I also think that it's forcing us to grapple with things that we didn't have to grapple with before. So this is the thing I love about media. It shines a spotlight on the things that we didn't previously see. This democracy has always been fucked. It's come on. Let's get into the root of this. Anybody who thinks that we are post-racist, what? You're crazy, right? And so what's tricky about this stuff is that it's making visible dynamics that have been with us for forever. And I think that's one of the reasons why, I have to admit, the thing that was most shocking to me on November 8th was how shocking it was to so many other people. So I was like, guys, this isn't new. And I think that's one of the things we have to contend with is, what does it mean that we've also purposefully put blinders on? Because putting blinders on is actually wonderful, right? It's nice. It makes us feel good about the world. We love to live in our little gated communities of varying forms. And one of the things that I think that we really are contending with because of these technologies right now is geopolitical and national dynamics at scale that have been with us forever and are dark. And the question is whether or not that will totally destabilize you, whether your response to this is to just go and crawl in a corner. And if you do, I get it. This stuff sucks. Or whether you can use this to motivate to fight. And I, for one, am really hopeful, because I actually think that there is a fight to be fought, and I think people paying attention to it means that we can actually do something about it. I think you've got the mic. Who's got Renee? Oh, no, you go for it.
Hi, I'm Victor. Thank you for an excellent talk, very thought-provoking. I've been live tweeting almost every third sentence you've been saying, and I've tweeted out now pictures of Pepe and Pedo Bear and Fox News. I didn't ever think I would do those things. So my question is, am I part of the problem?
Huh? That's a great... In September of last year, I called up the publisher or executive editor of pretty much a very major national paper. And I was like, shit's going down, we got a problem, I need reporters in this environment with me, help. And they consistently told me I was insane. I got a lot of phone calls on November 9th. Because what they told me was we know what we know, the election's in the bag, the polls are really obvious. I'm like, what do you mean we know what we know? Like, how is knowledge constructed? Come on, we can go academic on this real fast. And after that, I sat there and said, how much do I put out there? How much do I share? And for most of 2016, I shared a lot of what I was studying very quietly with a very small group of people who were trying to influence the ways and the actions that they were taking. I have started talking a lot more publicly, as the network of researchers that I'm working with, because I don't know how to have this conversation when I'm watching every major system backfire on itself. I don't know how to tell journalists to shut up in a way where, you know, they're going to actually have impact unless I can actually explain why. But there are also attack vectors that I didn't include here, because I know I'm being videotaped, because I know that this is a large room that's talking, because I know people are live tweeting. And that's really tricky for me, because there's a lot of things that are coming that I'm deeply, deeply concerned about, that I actually think we can do something about, but the question is how to talk about it at the right scale. The tricky thing about social media is that, by and large, frankly, most of the people that are going to be watching you are the people that are already in your network. They probably share a certain worldview as yours. But at the same time, you're feeding into and shaping a much larger conversation that's not part of your own thinking. And that's where the tension plays out, right? That's where the multiple reads go. That's part of this information landscape. So the question for me becomes, how do we navigate the very nuanced, complex, messy nature where we are all being part of the problem, and how do we also educate people to help stand up to it? And that is the balance that I'm struggling with on a daily basis. I'm here today, and I agreed to do this talk, because all of you are completely committed to learning and youth and education and digital technologies as part of it. And as a result, the reality is that I think of you as frontline soldiers on what will be a really hardcore cultural war. And so my invitation to you is to be a part of that. And to be a part of that also means reaching out to and engaging the people in your networks. So the question is whether the posts on your Twitter account help engage your peers, your friends, your fellow allies, or whether they just become a fetishization of a very racist political agenda. And I think that's one of the questions we always have to ask, and the question I had to ask as building this deck, right? That deck is filled with deeply disturbing references, right? And I'm doing it simultaneously to get you emotionally engaged with it and to help you see that this is a reality that many people see on a regular basis, a reality that is online and a reality that is in our news. But it's a really tricky thing, because there's one way to read what I just did, which is basically to indoctrinate you into a set of fetishization over, you know, anti-Semitic, neo-Nazi, racist views, right? So I think that's back to the very questions of what it means to be a critical thinker, what it means to be literate in these media ecosystems, and what it means to grapple with this grand old mess we're in. Who got the mic in the process? You got, that way.
Thank you. Actually, building off of your talking about critical thinking, the way that you framed critical thinking here was just, or at least talking about it as it being twisted, was asking questions. And when I think of critical thinking, I actually think more of having a framework of understanding and applying that framework of understanding to the contexts that you're encountering. And that framework of understanding has to do with power and you know, all those kinds of things. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are the elements of the framework of understanding that would be important, that you'd like? You know, I'm standing here as a teacher educator. I'm going to be working with teachers who are working with kids. What kind of framework could I offer to them, and what are the elements of that framework?
Right. I think the difficulty is that everybody brings with them a framework in which they are making sense of things. And the question is what they value in constructing that framework. How much of that is constructed through faith, through religious belief? How much of that is constructed through experience? How much of that is constructed through scientific evidence? How much of each of those epistemological frames is used to reject the other epistemological frames? And I think that's one of the reasons why these questions are so difficult, because the issue at stake is often undermining somebody's epistemological worldview. in order to ask them to take on evidence that contradicts that. As humans, we're terrible at this, right? And I don't know that it's my responsibility or your responsibility to challenge someone's faith. And I think that's what makes a lot of this very, very difficult. It also means that we have really weird and awkward cultural conversations that we don't even know how to work our way out of. So I don't know how many of you follow Jay-Z, but he's in a lot of hot shit right now for a song lyric that he put out, which is deeply anti-Semitic, right? And it's the constant pejorative notion that Jews are wealthy, and that they're the ones who actually control money and they control power. And it's a passing song lyric, but of course the ADL is pissed. And the response, of course, that's coming from his management is to say that, well, you know, I don't find it offensive and I'm Jewish. It's always a problematic starting point. And, you know, the other thing is, well, he meant it as a compliment, right, which is another really good one. For which, let's be honest, we would never accept that frame if he was critiquing certain other populations, or if a non-black or African-American person was making those same comments about black and African-American culture. So part of what's also tricky is the way in which our own subject position, where he is allowed, and one of the other defenses was that he mocks and uses stereotypes of black and African-American men. And what's the difference between what it means to critique or understand a demographic for which you are a part of or participate versus externally? How do you grapple with that? That kind of dynamic is where we see these things all play into challenge, right? We're not even sure how to work our way about that, even if we can have a meaningful and healthy conversation around race in this country, which I'm not always confident that we can. So how do we deal with that? And why I see this stuff as getting twisted is because it's not just about asking questions, but it's about asking questions from a foundation and a framework that I often find as deeply concerning, right? And that framework is one of distrust in institutions and information intermediaries. That framework is one of faith and experience over science. That one is like, oh, well, you know, doctors are just telling you things because they're bought, right? The media is just telling you things because they're profitable, right? And all are there because they're capitalist. And there's truth in all of this, as we know. And we know that the world is extraordinarily nuanced. And we know at the same time that we don't want to hear detailed, nuanced information. So what is the critical framework for thinking about it? And I think a lot of it has to go beyond just asking questions. And that's the important pedagogical mode. But it has to be understanding and appreciating what is that framework from which you are operating, what is the framework from which other people in this room are operating, and how do we negotiate those differences? And I'll say this because one of the things that I think is critical when I think about applying research into practice is to sit there and get a room to articulate for themselves what do they know, what do they not know, what do they believe, and where are their contradictions in their beliefs. Because that's the only way we can move these things forward. But that means that when you're sitting there with your students, one of the hardest things is to realize that they don't all share your worldview. And how do you grapple with that? Because let's be honest, it's very hard to talk and communicate when you don't know where you're starting from. I started with a huge set of assumptions about who you are in this room. And I used that framework to shape how I talked with you about a whole set of messy issues. Some of you may not share my worldview. Some of you may not share my goals and my agendas. What does that mean about how you then interpreted what I just shared? And I think that's also where it's challenging for us as educators to sit and think through what it means to communicate and how we like to gloss over or think that other people share at least our goals, if not our current starting place. I'm kicked off. Thank you all.
I'll thank Danah in just a moment. Apparently, folks might have the wrong hashtag. It's 27 DML is the correct one, not 2017 DML, not the reverse, right? I want to thank Danah for a really deeply interesting critical talk. As she was talking, I was thinking that I, after a very long time, have to reread Willem Reich's Mass Psychology of, not just in the literal sense, but that too, but in the sense that she's rewriting the very text, right? So as one is rereading that text, one's also rethinking the very terms of the argument in Reich's mass psychology of fascism for what one might characterize as a civil war of our time, right? Not just a cultural war, but an extended sort of engagement around this set of issues. There are a number of announcements. So to Danah, thank you so much for that really fantastic intervention. There are a number of announcements at 12:30 today. I'm happy to say that there's a sort of pop-up session with Ricardo Dominguez, who's standing at the back there in Pacific D. Today is the deadline for the renewal of Daca for those who are directly impacted by it. We've asked Ricardo from UC San Diego to come and talk to us. He will talk, the talk will be Contra Deportation, Fighting Injustice with Electronic Civil Disobedience. So really interesting engagement around the set of questions involved over here, about which Ricardo has been working, or on which he's been working for decades. I'm happy to say that Contra Pizzagate, there will be pizza available, first come, first served. Sorry for those who don't eat pizza, join me. But please do come, it's from 12:30 to 2, and it'll be a really, really interesting engagement. From 4:45 to 5:45, the Ignite Talks round 1, so there's one today, one tomorrow, this afternoon at 4:45 for an hour. Also in Pacific D, which will be hosted by Sybil Madison Boyd, so please join us for that. Following which, at 6 o'clock, the opening reception and tech showcase in the Pacific Ballroom C, which is of course next door. I'm not sure what Pacific Ballroom we're in at the moment, but they're along the strip over here. And then we have the announcement of DML2017 giveaway, which is a Piper computer kit that will not be raffled off, but for the best engagement with the virtual engagement with the conference, whether it's tweeting or whether it's a blog post, and we will announce the winner by the end of the day tomorrow. So do get engaged. The lure is this Piper computer kit. You'll be able to build your own. Please do engage with us, and we look forward to it. So once again, thank you very much. Thanks to Danah for this great talk and getting us going, and I look forward to engaging you over the next 2 days. Thank you very much.